The first mistake people make when they hear the story is assuming it begins with 9 hikers. It doesn't. It begins with silence. That kind of silence that makes a man feel like he is being watched by something that doesn't need eyes. You know the type, the silence that feels like a decision has already been made about you and you just haven't been informed yet. In February 1959, Soviet Russia didn't send 9 young hikers into the Ural Mountains. It sent 9 witnesses, and the mountain wasn't just a mountain. To some, it was a place where the earth itself keeps its own record, without mercy, without bias, without explanation. They tell you this story like it's about hypothermia. They list the names like it's a memorial. They show you photographs, grainy and innocent, as if innocence has ever protected anyone. Look deeper. Look past the frostbite, the torn flesh, the missing eyes. This isn't just about death. This is about control. This is about the moment when structure, Soviet protocol, engineering logic, human rationality collided with something older than language. Before there were governments, before there were maps, before there was even a word for fear, there were places on this earth where men vanished and the land swallowed their names. The official records call it Dyatlov Pass, but it didn't have that name when they climbed it. Back then, to the native Mansi people, it was called Kolatsyakhl, Mountain of the Dead. Not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. In their stories, this wasn't a mountain you conquered. It was a boundary, a threshold between the world that keeps track of you and the world that doesn't. The hikers never stood a chance. Not because they were weak, but because they still believed the world was reasonable. They believed equations could measure risk, that preparation could outmaneuver fate. That belief was their first step toward death. Picture this. A tent on a slope at dusk. Inside, 9 engineers, athletes, students, young people trained to solve problems. The fabric of the tent flutters like a heartbeat. The wind claws against the canvas. Outside, the mountain exhales slowly, bearing traces of their footsteps, as if correcting an intrusion. One of them laughs at a joke. Someone adjusts the stove. They make notes in their journals, confident that tomorrow will arrive like it always does. They don't understand yet that tomorrow has already been denied. That's the part that makes your skin crawl, isn't it? Not the death, the certainty. The knowledge that somewhere after they pitched that tent, but before the cold took their hands, something made a decision about them. And whatever it was, it didn't rush. When the rescuers arrived days later, they found the tent slashed from the inside. That's the detail that haunts professionals, not the gore, not the missing tongues, not the crushed ribs. No, it's that cut, clean, controlled, voluntary. As if 9 logical minds agreed to do something no logical mind would ever do. Step half-dressed into a Siberian death storm on purpose. Ask yourself, what makes a human being do that? What makes a trained radio engineer cut through shelter and walk into winds that tear skin from bone? Fear? No. Panic leaves chaotic traces. Their footprints were calm, organized. Every rescue expert who examined those prints said the same thing. They walked like people who believed they were coming back. That kind of terror isn't loud. It's the kind that whispers. It's not the scream in your ear telling you to run. It's the pressure in your skull telling you the place you're standing has already forgotten your name. And that's the real story here. This isn't about 9 hikers dying. This is about 9 identities being erased, methodically, efficiently, without fanfare. The Soviet report stamped it as an unknown compelling force. That phrase has been mocked for decades. But what if it wasn't incompetence? What if it was accuracy? Because something did compel them. Something so absolute it bypassed survival instinct. Something that didn't need to chase them. It only needed to make them understand. You do not belong here. Most people listen to this story to feel spooked. They want a ghost tale, a military cover-up, a mutant experiment gone wrong. They want to point at something and say, there, that's the monster. But the truth is colder. The truth is that there exists a form of death that doesn't need claws or bullets. It only needs a moment of compliance, a moment when you accept the idea that leaving safety makes more sense than staying alive. That's not just mountain logic. That's how systems break people. That's how institutions erase dissidents, how regimes disappear the inconvenient, quietly, logically, with paperwork that says everything and reveals nothing. So let me ask you, What if Dyatlov wasn't just an accident? What if it was a demonstration, a reminder that nature, government, and fate all share one terrifying trait? They don't argue, they simply act, and you either submit or your story gets filed under unresolved. You're not just here to learn about what killed them, you're here to recognize the pattern. Because this isn't just a historical anomaly, this is a map, a template, a way the world deals with those who cross thresholds they were never meant to cross, and once you see it, you will start recognizing it everywhere. They boarded the train with warmth still in them, laughter, photographs, the human belief in tomorrow, the reels we have of them, the smiling faces, the gloved hands wavy, from the window, feel like ghosts calling from inside a machine that hasn't realized they're dead yet. Look at those frames long enough and you start to feel it. That creeping sensation that these aren't just memories but warnings captured on film, as if the mountain allowed these images to exist not as souvenirs, but as evidence. 9 members. Igor Dyatlov, the engineer obsessed with precision, the kind of man who believed nature could be outplanned. Zina with her quiet fire, who laughed in every photograph like she couldn't imagine a world cruel enough to swallow her. Rustem, the runner, all endurance and willpower, as if muscle alone could defy fate. Lyudmila, young but carved from stone, the one who had already been shot in a previous hike and walked home bleeding just to prove that pain had no command over her. The Uris, inseparable, reckless in the way only people who don't believe in death can be. Nikolai, methodical, careful. Kolya, the physicist, who wrote everything down as though recording reality could bind it in place. And finally, Semyon Zolotaryov, the war veteran who joined them last, older, silent, marked by things he never spoke about. Men who carry war in their bones walk differently. They don't fear cold, they don't fear hunger, they fear memory. And something about this hike, this path, this mountain, made even him take notes. Ask yourself why. Why would a decorated soldier who had survived bullets and artillery die here, half-dressed in the snow with his ribs shattered inward like he'd been hit by a force the autopsy couldn't classify? Why were his journal entries, the last written by any of them, structured, calm, almost rehearsed? When you study the photographs taken on their journey, something begins to emerge. In the first reels, their posture is relaxed, their bodies loose with the unspoken confidence of youth. But as the days progress, their shoulders draw inward. Their gazes shift off frame, like something just outside camera range demanded their attention. One by one, those bright faces become distant. Journal entries grow shorter, precise, stripped of light, not fear, focus, like the kind a man has right before he makes a decision that will end him. They reach the last settlement with spoons still clanking in mess halls, with locals nodding out the usual warnings about wind and whiteouts. The villagers saw nothing strange, but locals never see the storm building, not in the sky, but in people. They don't see the subtle tightening of the spine. The moment the group stops talking as much, the kind of silence that isn't emptiness, but containment, like pressure building behind a dam. Years later, searchers would reconstruct their path using recovered negatives, frame by frame, step by step, as if mapping the psychology of a vanishing. You want to know the part that chills even trained investigators? It's how normal everything looked until it wasn't. The campfires were controlled, the tents were ordered, the diaries were logical. Then, nothing. A clean break in narrative, like someone ripped the last pages out of reality and forced a new chapter without warning. That's when you begin to understand. It wasn't chaos that killed them. It was transition. A shift from the world where human reason applies into one where reason becomes a liability. Look closely at the final group photo taken just before they pitched their tent. Wind screaming, snow ripping across their faces, and yet none of them look afraid. They look decisive. Thousands of men have died on mountains, but these 9 did something almost no one else has ever done. They walked away from their only shelter under controlled steps. They cut their way out from inside with surgical precision. They left behind gear that meant life. They selected death with order. No stumbling, no sprinting, no madness. Footprints in a clean line. That's not fear. That's obedience, not to any human leader, not to superstition, something far more absolute, the instinct that whispers when logic becomes irrelevant, the kind of instinct you feel when you realize you have crossed a boundary unnoticed. That's why this story haunts. It's not because of radiation readings on their clothes, not because of reports of orange orbs in the sky, not because of missing tongues or shattered ribs with no external trauma. Those are distractions. The real horror is acceptance. Something made them accept death with clarity. And this is the part nobody speaks aloud in documentaries or podcasts because it threatens a truth deeper than murder mysteries and conspiracy drama. The Dyatlov case is not just an unsolved death. It is a perfect metaphor for controlled erasure. A system, whether natural or institutional, does not need to destroy you violently. It only needs to make you walk away from your shelter willingly. That is how disappearances happen in plain sight. That is how regimes erase names from history without leaving scars. That is how a mountain teaches obedience without words. It doesn't chase, it waits, until you participate in your own erasure. 9 footprints, clean, intentional, straight into the storm. There is a point in every controlled catastrophe where logic doesn't just fail, it turns against you. That's the part most people miss about Dyatlov. They keep searching for the external threat. A bomb test, a creature, a weapon, a tribal curse. Because it's easier to blame something visible, but the truth hiding in the autopsy tables and the footprint trajectories is colder. The mountain didn't need to attack them, it only needed to wait until logic made them comply. Understand this, intelligent people die differently. They don't thrash, they don't run blind, they calculate, they justify, they accept. And when you accept under pressure, your death becomes indistinguishable from your decision. That is the most efficient form of erasure, one where the victim participates in the method. Look again at their routine before the storm. Every move documented, every kilometer logged. Temperatures, wind reports, rations, they catalogued reality to anchor themselves in control. And that is the flaw. The need to quantify is a weakness in places where reality does not care for numbers. The more control they attempted to exert, the more the mountain shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, until what was familiar became strange and what was safe became threatening. Not through violence, but through logic being turned inward. The tent, that is the moment the trap closes. They pitched it on an exposed slope, not out of recklessness, but out of deliberate strategic thinking. Camping lower in the tree line would have given them warmth, shelter, silence from the wind. But Dyatlov calculated elevation gain, route efficiency, and time lost descending and climbing. In his mind, comfort was a distraction. Efficiency was discipline. Do you see it now? Discipline, when removed from intuition, becomes a weapon used against you. Now imagine the inside of that tent just after midnight, the stove unassembled, boots lined neatly by the entrance to dry, bodies wrapped in blankets, the sound of wind pressing harder against canvas. Someone wakes first. They hear it, not a roar, not a scream, but pressure, the kind of pressure your brain can't categorize. The slope frame shifting under compacted snow, a shift in the wind angle, the weight distribution changes, survival instincts sharpen. And here is the split-second decision that defines the entire case. A normal mind panics, grabs boots, rips the exit open, sprints, but their footprints show no sprint. They organized. 9 people came to a silent agreement. Cut the tent, exit now, return later. No one took boots, no one grabbed the stove. They obeyed procedure even while choosing death. That is not hysteria. That is the moment logic became the executioner. The forensic investigators who saw those cut lines in the canvas were trained to recognize chaos. They expected clawing, tearing struggle. What they saw instead chilled them more than any myth could. Clean, upward cuts. A methodical escape, as if someone said, "Do not open the flap. Cut. Single file. Move." This is where you need to understand a darker truth. Human beings will follow order even into death, so long as it looks structured. People don't fear dying. They fear dying outside of instruction. That's why soldiers walk into gunfire. That's why workers stay in burning factories waiting for clearance. That's why 9 hikers in -30 degrees walked calmly into a blizzard with the belief that returning would be permitted once the situation stabilized. Logic gave them permission to leave safety, and so they did. When the footprints were documented later, investigators remarked how deep and consistent they were. Each step pressed clearly into the snow with no erratic spacing. That means their hearts were not in panic rhythm yet. Panic creates sprint patterns, variable depth, chaotic staggering. These prints walked like obedience on ice. Do you understand the horror now? They didn't think they were dying, they believed they were complying. That is why this story is not simply tragic, it is instructive. It is a perfect demonstration of how systems kill without violence. You don't need monsters when human logic can be redirected inward until it slices through its own shelter. Every authoritarian state learns this principle eventually. Real obedience doesn't look like fear. It looks like cooperation. You don't need to chase people into the snow. You just need to make them believe that stepping into death is the proper protocol. The Soviet Union archived this case. They stamped it with bureaucratic precision. Cause of death, unknown compelling force. People treated that phrase like incompetence. It wasn't. It was confession. A force powerful enough to compel rational minds to walk calmly into annihilation is more dangerous than any creature, bomb, or avalanche. It is a force that understands psychology. And once you see that, every photograph of those hikers changes. They are no longer smiling youths. They are participants in a lesson written not in screams, but in footprints and silence. And the worst part, the same force exists in your world. In meetings, in headlines, in systems that don't shove you. They nudge you, not with force, with logic. Somewhere between the tent and the tree line, the last trace of civilization left them. Up until that moment, cutting the canvas, walking in formation through the whiteout, they were still hikers, still a unit, still a group defined by shared purpose. But survival is a cruel accountant. It starts dividing people into categories with no ceremony, those who still believe in returning, and those who don't. At approximately 5 kilometers from the tent, the land changes character. It shifts from exposed slope to fractured forest, a place where wind screams transform into distant howls, muffled by branches heavy with ice. The records show this clearly. 2 sets of footprints break slightly ahead of the others, not in panic, not fleeing, moving with intent. Those footprints belong to Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonoshenko, the strongest in the group, the ones most likely to reach shelter first. It wasn't heroism, it was assignment. They weren't running for themselves, they were going to start a fire so the others would have a beacon, a promise that logic still had meaning. Remember this, fire is not just heat. Fire is hope made visible. In freezing darkness, a flame becomes a belief system. The first responders later found the remains of that fire. Not the roaring blaze of survival tales, but a small, stunted burn pit, barely the width of a human torso. The bark of the cedar tree beside it was peeled off in strips, 5 meters upward, higher than a man could easily reach. The forensic team noted skin tissue embedded in the bark, streaks of blood, claw marks made not in terror, but in discipline. They weren't screaming. They were climbing, breaking branches efficiently, mechanically, even as finger skin split open from cold and wood splinters. One autopsy note stands out like a whisper you wish you never heard. Frostbite present, but fingertips burned black, indicative of skin contacting flame in extreme proximity. That means they pressed themselves into the fire to feel something, anything, before nerves died completely. Understand the progression of cold. At 30 degrees, nerves in the extremities fail in less than 5 minutes. Pain vanishes, judgment warps. Your own body becomes unrecognizable to your mind. You begin to feel warmth instead of cold. This phenomenon is known clinically as cold euphoria. To those dying, it feels like permission to give up. The 2 Yuris fought that instinct like soldiers in a war most people don't even know exists. The war against slow surrender. Searchers found them side by side, positioned almost symmetrically, as if they had collapsed mid-task. No signs of struggle, no defensive wounds. one with his arm draped over the other, not in panic, but in final recognition. Two men who had built countless campfires before, unable to build one that mattered. The mountain didn't stop them with teeth or avalanche. It simply removed time from the equation. They didn't freeze because they were weak. They froze because they believed they still had time. Time to gather wood, time to keep the fire alive, time for the others to return. But it can time our enemies in places like this. When you follow logic in an environment that has already denied your return, you die with discipline. Look closer at the cedar tree. Investigators photographed it in black and white. Frost clung to the torn bark like veins. The scratches spiraled upward, not random, vertical, organized. Finger trails in ice. They weren't trying to escape, they were trying to see, to get high enough to spot the tent through the storm, to confirm that rescue was still an option, that this was still a temporary detour and not the final trajectory of their lives. Here is the most chilling forensic observation in the entire Dyatlov file. The fire was built, sustained briefly, then abandoned while still glowing. That means they stopped tending it before it died. They didn't run. They didn't fall instantly. They stopped on purpose, perhaps to turn back, perhaps to call out, perhaps because they realized something no one wants to face in their final minutes. The fire was not a beacon. It was a funeral flame. Once that truth registers, hope becomes dangerous. It freezes you faster than the wind, and here is the moment where this case ceases to be about hikers and becomes about you. Because there are fires in your life right now that you tend to with discipline, efforts, routines, systems, kept alive not because they will save you, but because you can't bear to accept that they were never meant to save you. Relationships, jobs, identities, beliefs, fires that burn but don't warm, fires that signal compliance, not salvation. 9 hikers did not die from exposure, they died from belief. Belief that if they followed procedure, if they kept moving, kept building, kept obeying the silent rule of logic, they could return. The mountain never chased them. It only waited for them to realize they were already gone. Next, we follow 3 figures crawling back toward the tent, still trying to return to the life they had already left. By the time the fire flickered its last ember under the cedar, 3 figures had already begun to turn back. Their silhouettes barely visible through the storm, moving not with hope, but with compulsion, as if something behind them was more terrifying than the cold ahead. Igor Dyatlov, Zina Kolmogorova, Rustam Slobodin, 3 who refused to die beside a dying fire, 3 who believed, even as their skin cracked and their lungs crystallized, that returning was still an option. This detail matters. They walked uphill, against wind, against pain, against the primal instinct to curl around the last heat source and let sleep take them. That is not survival instinct. That is identity refusing erasure. It's not just that they wanted to live. They wanted to return to the tent because the tent represented who they were, hikers, engineers, organized minds. To die beside the fire would have been to accept a new identity, victim. The snow hardened beneath them as they climbed. Rescue teams later reconstructed their journey step by step. Dyatlov's footprints lead. His stride shortens every few meters, then stabilizes, then falters again. Beside his tracks, drag marks, evidence of collapse, but every time the body rose again, he was crawling back to the last place his name still existed. Remember what I told you earlier, death by logic is quiet, and in this moment their logic was this: if he can reach the tent, we can revive the others, restart the stove, reclaim control. That's the last lie a dying mind tells itself. Zina collapses first. The wind shoves her sideways into the snow, but her handprint shows she pushed herself back up. Autopsy reports show bruising on her knuckles, defensive wounds without an attacker. She punched the snow. She fought the mountain itself. Frostbite had already started claiming her fingertips, yet she clawed her way upward, leaving streaks of blood on the ice that rescue teams noted but did not understand. Imagine her breath, crystallizing mid-exhale, hanging in the air like ghosts following behind them. Her hair stiff with frost, sticking to her face. Her eyes locking on the ridge where she believed the tent still stood like a beacon of structure. The wind at this point was strong enough to alter auditory perception, creating auditory hallucinations. The illusion of distant voices, tents flapping, people calling your name. The mountain doesn't speak. It echoes you back at yourself until you chase your own voice. Rustam Slobodin falls next. His footsteps trail, then stop abruptly. Investigators found a fracture in his skull, not from a blow but from a controlled impact, as if he fell forward deliberately, forehead first, into the snow. A surrender that looked like persistence. He tried to stand again. They know this because the heel imprints deepen ahead, his last stubborn steps stamped into the ice with soldier-like defiance. But cold strips dignity with mathematical precision. He collapsed face forward and did not rise again. Dyatlov keeps moving. His footprints carry on alone. There is a moment, to anyone who studies the case deeply, where the trail tells you something horrifying without language. For several meters, he walks in a straight line with perfect spacing. That only happens when a human being believes fully that the next step will take them home. And then, the line curves. The stride weakens. The last prints are erratic, looping, circling. That is when the mountain wins, not when the body falls, but when direction is lost. The rescuers found Dyatlov curled on his back, facing the tense direction, hands clenched around a branch, not a weapon, but a symbol. He died like a man still choosing to return. Most analysts say they were trying to get back, but that isn't the full truth. They weren't trying to return to the tent, they were trying to return to who they were before the cut in the canvas. This is where the binding phrase enters. If you are still here, still listening, you are not just learning, you are crossing a threshold too. Comment this twice. The mountain remembers once for them, once for yourself, to mark that you will not move through the rest of your life asleep. Symbols matter. Ritual binds memory. This is not just for the algorithm, it is a declaration. You see the pattern now, because you too have walked away from your own tents before. From safety, from identity, from truth, calmly, logically, believing you would return. And not everyone does. There is a saying among forensic analysts, cold preserves truth. In most mountain deaths, the snow keeps the story intact. Frozen skin, clear trauma patterns, footprints that map desperation. But the ravine rejected that rule. It did not preserve truth. It rewrote it. 40 meters from the cedar, beyond the last coherent footprints, the slope dips sharply into a ravine cut by frozen water. Here, searchers expected to find more bodies like the first three, cold, curled, still clinging to direction. What they found instead did not match the mountain's logic. It matched something else, something older and far less patient. The first was Lyudmila Dubinina, face pressed into ice, hands locked in a position that didn't look like collapse. It looked like impact. As if she had struck something mid-fall, the flesh around her mouth was gone, her tongue was missing. Official reports noted soft tissue loss, but informal testimonies from those at the scene whispered something different. Removed, not torn, removed. No bite pattern, no animal gnawing, no frost erosion, a precision nobody wanted to put in writing. Beside her lay Semyon Zolotaryov, the war veteran. The man who had survived artillery fire, who had tattoos no one could translate, who once stood against death and did not blink. His chest, crushed inward, not pierced, not torn, compressed. Forensic term. Trauma consistent with high impact force equivalent to a car collision at 60 kilometers per hour. But there were no external bruises, no skin ruptures, as if pressure had been applied from all sides at once. What does that to a human body without leaving a mark? Science has a phrase for that kind of event. Non-penetrative massive trauma. But that phrase doesn't explain, it hides, it tucks horror into clinical language so the mind doesn't rebel. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, similar damage, skull fracture, massive, yet with no tearing of skin or scalp. The coroners struggled to put it into language that wouldn't draw unwanted attention. They called it blunt force trauma. But blunt force leaves a point of contact. This didn't. It was as if the air itself had crushed him like a vice. And then, Alexander Kolevatov. His injuries the least dramatic, yet his final posture spoke volumes. He died with his hands clasped around his head, as if protecting it from something unseen above him. No frostbite on his face. That means he was alive long enough to feel something coming. Before it did. Pause here. 4 bodies. Unexpected location, missing tongues, missing eyes, crushed chests with no surface damage. The official narrative fractures, the logic collapses. Every diagram the rescuers tried to draw to explain formation, position, final direction, spirals into nonsense. So they did what institutions always do when truth becomes unmanageable. They sealed the case with language, official cause of death, a compelling force, not avalanche, not hypothermia, force. Force is a word that doesn't accuse. Force is a word that doesn't answer. So let's ask the question plainly. What force kills without tearing? What force removes tongues without bite marks? What force causes 3 people to die from cold and 4 to die from pressure? What force splits a group's fate so perfectly that half die in logic and half die in something that looks like punishment? Look again at Lyudmila. Autopsy report. Soft tissue of the oral cavity absent. Coroner's underlined note. Edges clean. Clean. Take that word seriously. Clean means intentional. People love to say wild animals did it, but wild animals don't remove organs selectively. They tear, they chew, they leave chaos. But this was a correction. Let's step back. Look at 2. He patterned not with fear, but with clarity. Those who stayed by the fire died trying to create hope. Those who climbed back died trying to reclaim identity. Those who reached the ravine died differently. Their bodies didn't read as lost. They read as taken. The forensic team noted something else, something buried deep in the files. Bodies found covered with branches arranged in a linear fashion. Arranged, not fallen. Someone or something covered them. And so, here at the edge of explanation, we return to the knowledge that this was never just a mountain. This was a boundary zone, a place where logic leads you to the edge, and something else finishes you. This is not about ghosts. This is not about monsters. This is about domains, territory, boundaries not fenced by wood or wire, but by consequence. When you cross a threshold you did not know existed, the punishment is silence. First the cold, then the logic, then the pressure, then the burial. That is the sequence, that is the system. And now you've seen it. Cold kills the body, but archives kill the story. That's the part nobody prepares you for. People think death is the end. It isn't. The real end is classification, the moment your name becomes a file, a case number, a sealed document with language specifically engineered to disarm curiosity. When the Dyatlov bodies were finally recovered and lined in a frozen row beneath military tents, the mountains stopped killing. From that moment on, the system began. Photographs exist, blurred, hurried shots taken by first responders before the officials arrived. In some you can see the faces of rescuers changed. They are not fearful, they are quiet. There is an expression some call recognition without comprehension, as if they saw something their minds technically processed but could not categorize. And then the men from Sverdlovsk arrived, not doctors, not mountain rangers, officers, plainclothes, but with posture that speaks of authority. Men whose job is not to understand but to contain. From that point forward, the scene changed. Diaries were collected, photographs were seized, local testimonies were rewritten with clarified phrasing, autopsy reports began to omit adjectives. No more mysterious, no more strange, only medical terms with no psychological interpretation. Witnesses later claimed that original notes had more emotional language, that trauma descriptions were stripped of tone. Any mention of fear, presence, light, or voices was edited away before being entered into the official record. The coroner, Dr. Vozrojdeny, initially wrote, "The I-die juries are of a kind I have never encountered in open environment trauma." Later, the statement appeared in the final report as trauma inconsistent with standard environmental exposure. Language. Softened to remove impact, because if language stays sharp, it keeps cutting. If you blunt it, people stop bleeding. Investigators wanted to interview the Mansi tribespeople who called the mountain sacred. Instead, the questioning turned into interrogation. They were photographed, fingerprinted, accused of murder. Their hunting knives were measured against injuries that left no cuts. Still, they were held, not because they were suspects, but because they were witnesses to a boundary being crossed. The Soviets were terrified of something, and it wasn't ghosts. It was narrative. Understand this. A mystery is dangerous to a system built on order. Mysteries invite questions. Questions invite chaos. Erasure is easier, so a phrase was created. Unknown compelling force. It was not a conclusion, it was a containment field made of words. That phrase did something clever. It satisfied official curiosity without feeding public curiosity. It acknowledged something powerful happened without naming it, because once you name a thing, you invite accountability. Then came the photographic redactions, certain frames from the recovered film reels. Missing, not damaged, removed. One searcher claimed there was an image showing a light source above the slope, brighter than a flare, too controlled to be accident. That frame is not in the final archive. One archivist, years later, leaked a note scribbled in the margin of a logbook entry. Bodies show signs of directed energy trauma. Directed energy trauma. 3 words that should not exist in 1959 field reports. That phrase was crossed out. You see the pattern now, not censorship. Correction, not lies. Framing. The youngest volunteer in the recovery team, 21-year-old Vladimir, left the site before the military sealed it. He resigned 3 days later, telling a friend in a tavern, "The snow wasn't empty, there was something in it that watched us." The friend tried to report this statement in his testimony. It does not appear in the official record. And so quietly, efficiently, like a mountain wind smoothing footprints, the Soviet machine flattened the narrative. The case was closed within 3 months, files stamped, families silenced. A mother who begged to see her son's unedited autopsy was told, "There is nothing here for you to understand." That sentence is more chilling than the cold, because it carries an unspoken message. Understanding is not permitted, closure is not permitted, only compliance. Just like the hikers under the tent, we are expected to accept leaving the warmth of certainty and walk out calmly into the cold of official truth. But here's the difference. They walked believing they would return. We do not. When investigators gathered the scattered gear near the tent, they expected to find diaries, tools, maybe a camera or 2, standard equipment for an expedition. What they did not expect was that nearly every member of the Dyatlov team had brought a camera. Multiple rolls of film, redundant documentation of a journey only meant to be a training exercise. Engineers document. It is their reflex, their form of control. But here's the rule. What you document also documents you. Several cameras were found inside the tent, frozen but intact. Others were discovered around the bodies, strapped to chests, even as fingers blackened from frost. Think about that. They ran into a blizzard half-dressed, but brought their cameras. Who reaches for a camera when death is seconds away? That's not survival instinct, that's witness instinct. A primitive urge not just to live, but to make sure what you saw cannot be erased. Once developed, the reels revealed the expected: laughing faces, snow-covered slopes, improvised sleds, frost-bitten smiles, images heavy with youth and denial. Up until the final day, there is warmth in the light of the frames, and then the tone shifts, subtly at first, faces no longer centered in frame, camber angles tilted, as if taken in haste. Exposure values incorrect, a sign of shaking hands, subjects looking not into the lens, but past it. The last known full group image, frame 29, shows them standing near the tent site, snow blasting sideways, expressions unreadable through frost. Dyatlov's shoulders look tense, his stance rigid. A commander evaluating something unseen behind the camera. Frame 30, blurred, a smear of white and grey. Frame 31, sky, only sky, as if someone lifted the camera to the heavens or something above caught their eye. Frame 32, lost, never included in the official archive. A gap nobody explains. And then, frame 33. Even today, online debates rage about it. Some claim it's nothing, a light reflection, a processing error. Others swear it's the last photographic evidence of something in the sky. It shows a streak, diagonal, bright, controlled. Not a flare, not lightning. Too linear, too stable, too deliberate. The Soviets called it defective exposure. That's a convenient phrase. It closes doors. But one archivist, years later, under anonymity, described the original negative in different words. It did not look like light. It looked like direction. Direction. Think about that carefully. Light illuminates. Direction commands. The hikers, logical, disciplined, academically trained, stopped recording journal entries once the final frames were taken, as if the act of capturing that last image removed the need for writing, as if once the lens saw it, words no longer mattered. Why did they keep filming? Why did they lift a camera instead of running? Why did someone ensure frame 33 existed? Here is the unsettling hypothesis researchers avoid because it demands a shift in thinking. Perhaps they weren't filming for themselves anymore. Perhaps once something is watching you, you begin recording for them or it. There is a difference between documentation and offering. Was the camera their last attempt at control, or was it compliance? Now consider this. Not all negatives were reported. When the film inventory log was unofficially leaked, there were references to reels never entered into evidence, reels mentioned in handwritten logs that cease to appear once the military takes command. Those reels are gone, not damaged, not lost, gone. And here is the quiet part, the part whispered by retired mountain rescuers who were there before the officials arrived. There were more footprints, more than 9. Not human footprints, not animal, deep impressions, crisp in places where wind erased lighter tracks. When asked, the military officials responded coldly, irrelevant to cause of death, not denied, dismissed. There is a chasm between denial and dismissal. Denial fights truth. Dismissal erases it without engagement. That is more dangerous. When Dyatlov's team raised their cameras that final night, it was not to capture adventure. It was to bear witness to something inside the storm, something above them, something that made them accept a command no human voice spoke aloud. Leave the tent, leave the fire, leave the narrative you came with. The mountain didn't just erase them physically, it erased their roles. They were no longer hikers, no longer engineers. They became observers of their own removal. And frame 33, whatever it truly was, may have been the last moment a human hand tried to turn erasure into evidence. In survival training, there is a phrase whispered among elite units. When the order comes without a voice, obeying it feels like your own idea. It refers to a moment where external pressure becomes internal logic. The Dyatlov group did not think they were being controlled. That is why they obeyed. Understand the hierarchical dynamics of the team. Igor Dyatlov was not a loud leader. He was a structural one. He made lists. He defined order. And when a group travels under such leadership, something subtle forms in the mind, a shared discipline that replaces instinct. You don't panic because panic is disorder and disorder is failure. When the tent pressed inward under the snow slab, or whatever pressed against it, the decision to cut their way out and march in formation was not a breakdown. It was obedience to procedure. Every recovered footprint proves this. 9 figures descending in a clean, single-direction line. No divergence, no circling, no collapse into chaos. That is submission, but not to a leader. Dyatlov died far from the tent. His author, "It ended in the snow." What continued was not leadership, it was programming. This is why the Dyatlov case is now studied quietly in psychological warfare models, Western NATO training manuals from the 1970s, declassified partially in the 2000s, reference an Incident 1959 Ural group response pattern. A euphemistic title for what they observed, a disciplined team performing controlled retreat despite immediate threat of death. NATO analysts found it disturbing not because they died, but because they died orderly. The phrase used in the commentary section translated from French reads, "Voluntary exposure to lethal elements without visible coercion suggests external influence of nonverbal command." Let that sink in. Nonverbal command. What gives a command without speaking? Environment, authority, presence, or something that binds all three. They walked as if summoned. Here is something else. Group psychology under extreme conditions has 2 usual outcomes: fragment and panic. Individuals break formation, run irrationally, scatter. Cluster and barricade. Members cling to the last point of security, refusing movement. The Dyatlov group did neither. Instead, they performed a third pattern: coordinated displacement. They left safety and alignment, proceeding outward with mathematical spacing. This is not human nature. This is human compliance. Forensic examiners noted no signs of a struggle inside the tent, no clawing, no signs the cut was desperate. It was clean, controlled. Some of them even left wearing only socks, no boots. Yet they moved with structure, as if failing to comply with movement was worse than freezing. Modern analysts refer to this condition as transfer of command locus. When the group no longer sees the leader as the source of instruction, something else takes that place. Something implied, not spoken. The environment itself issues orders. Many believe avalanches caused the cut. But avalanches do not instruct you to walk in formation. They bury you alive. No signs of burial, no signs of panic, just execution of movement. Ask yourself, have you ever obeyed a feeling without questioning it? A moment when you stood up without knowing why, like your body moved before your mind decided. That is what we are seeing here, not irrational fear, but absolute compliance to something unseen. And here is the terrifying part. Once you understand it, you begin to recognize it in your own life, when crowds move before they understand the threat, when people agree to conditions that harm them because the authority is undefined but felt, when an entire population walks calmly into systems designed to erase them, not through violence, but through procedure. The Dyatlov Pass is not just a mountain tragedy, it is a mirror. Look at it long enough, and you will see your world reflected in it. How many have walked away from warmth, from identity, from truth, not in panic, but in obedience? How many walked in straight lines into systems that promised return, and never came back? Igor, Zina, Rustem, Lyudmila, Semyon, the Yuris, Kolya, Alexander, Nikolai, they thought they were returning. They died walking toward who they used to be. And that is the most chilling truth of all. Death did not chase them. It waited patiently on the path back to the tent, because once you walk away from yourself, coming back is not guaranteed. Search teams came in waves. They expected bodies scattered in chaos, signs of frantic struggle, claw marks in the snow. Instead, they found footsteps. Not just any footsteps, linear, spaced, calm, like soldiers moving in formation toward an unseen point of assembly, like citizens lining up obediently for a fate they don't believe will reach them. The mountain wasn't chasing, it was waiting. They dragged the bodies down in silence. No chants, no dramatic exclamations, just quiet men carrying frozen forms that still looked like they could stand up if someone just called their name. That's the detail that unsettles those who witnessed it. They didn't look dead, they looked paused, like sleep without return, like figures frozen mid-decision. Ask yourself, what does death look like when it comes without violence? When it comes not through fangs or fire, but through obedience to an invisible directive? What happens to a human mind when it accepts erasure as procedure? Look again at the recovered tent, slash marks only from the inside, as if safety had transformed into a trap disguised as comfort. How many people in your world live in that exact state, surrounded by what they believe is protection? Systems, rules, routines, yet unaware that those very structures are designed to keep them compliant until removal feels voluntary. Modern culture will tell you dying in fear is tragedy. But no, dying without resistance is worse. Fear means you still recognize danger. But when danger becomes a logical step, when the descent from the tent into the storm feels like reasonable action, then death is no longer an event. It is a process of quiet agreement. That is what Dyatlov represents. Not mystery, not conspiracy. Consent. Consent to leave warmth. Consent to abandon identity. Consent to walk in a straight line toward nothing, without ever realizing it was obedience that killed them, not the cold. This is the forbidden understanding buried beneath the autopsy files. No force was visible, but all of them obeyed something. Not all forces roar, not all commands shout. Some simply wait until you convince yourself the decision was yours, and here is where the story stops being about them and becomes about you. You, watching this, breathing warm air while listening to the story of 9 who froze under a sky they believed they understood. You hear their names and think, I would not have walked away from that tent, would you? How many times have you already done it? How many times have you stepped away from safety not because you were forced, but because you were gently instructed by logic that did not belong to you. How many slow deaths have you participated in? Careers that drained your soul but made sense on paper. Relationships that froze you from the inside out but looked stable in photographs. Systems that told you to comply calmly while they erased you. Footprints in the snow are not just forensic trails. They are signatures of consent. The Dyatlov Pass is not a place. It is a pattern, a tent, the illusion of safety, a cut, the decision point, a line of footprints, the path of controlled erasure, a dying fire, the last hope that someone will return, a ravine, where logic collapses and truth breaks bone, an archive, where narrative is sterilized and sealed away. They teach you to fear chaos. What you should fear is order that leads you to the edge and says nothing. Look again at those 9. They did not run. They did not scream. They complied, and that, more than any wound or mystery, is what chills deeper than ice, because once you see it, you stare. Noticing the footprints everywhere, in offices where people shuffle in rows to their own undoing, in cities where citizens obey laws that hollow them out but never break formation, in quiet lives where death has no drama, only procedure. This is your final image, a tent still standing, boots neatly arranged at its entrance. Inside, warmth, fire-making gear, shelter. Outside, a single-file line of footprints disappearing into white. One day you will stand at that threshold too. No blizzard, no mountain, just a moment when something inside you whispers, "Step out, it makes sense." And you will either obey, or you will remember this. Not all force is violent. Some of it is silent, and it waits for your consent.